Imagine a little boy sleeping alone in his backyard every night. But when the neighbors finally find out why, they don't think twice. They call the police. What they didn't know was that the truth was much darker than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of Lucas, a boy like any other who loved playing soccer and had dreams as big as his heart. But behind the wooden fence of the house where he lived, something was terribly wrong. His parents made a decision that would change his life forever and everyone around him. Lucas was the kind of child that everyone liked to have around. He was polite, smiling, and even at such a young age, seemed to understand the value of being kind to others. However, things began to change at a pace that no one in the neighborhood could explain. He, who used to be seen running with other boys along the sidewalks and playing soccer until dusk, became an almost invisible figure. Little by little, Lucas disappeared from playing in the park and stopped going to the bakery with the money his mother gave him to buy sweets. Soon, the only times he was seen were at night, lying on a makeshift mattress in the backyard. At first, the neighbors thought it was something temporary. Perhaps a punishment for bad grades at school or something trivial, like a childish fight between Lucas and his parents. However, the days turned into weeks, and the scene in the yard remained the same. A thin mattress thrown on the grass, blankets that barely seemed to protect him from the cold, and Lucas curled up in silence under the moonlight. The nights were getting colder and colder, and yet no one saw his parents bothering to take him inside. This began to generate speculation among the neighbors, and questions arose around every corner. Why was Lucas sleeping in the yard? Was it neglect? Some kind of severe punishment? Or was there something darker going on in that house? Some neighbors said they had heard sounds coming from the yard. They weren't screams or arguments, but the sound of muffled sobs, as if the boy was crying quietly so that no one would notice. For those closest to them, it was painful to watch the scene. Even those who didn't have children felt a squeeze in their hearts when they saw such a young boy being treated in a way that seemed inhumane, to say the least. One of the first to raise suspicions was Mr. Joao, a pensioner who lived next door. He always had a habit of staying out in the yard late, watering the plants or smoking a cigarette before going to bed. Joao began to pay more attention to the movements in Lucas' house. He noticed that the lights in the boys' room were always off, and instead the porch lights stayed on all night, casting an unsettling shadow over the yard where Lucas slept. Joao tried to broach the subject with Lucas' mother one afternoon when he saw her coming back from the supermarket. "Anna, is everything all right with the boy? I saw him sleeping outside the other day," he began, trying to sound casual. But Anna avoided eye contact and replied hastily, "Everything's fine, Joao. It's just a phase. He likes sleeping outside. He says it makes him feel calmer." The words seemed carefully chosen, but there was something different about her expression. It was as if she was hiding a truth she was afraid to reveal. Meanwhile, other neighbors began to notice worrying signs. Mrs. Helena, who lived across the street, claimed to have seen Lucas in the yard one afternoon, staring up at the sky as if lost in thought. When she called him over to ask how he was, he just nodded and mumbled something unintelligible without raising his eyes. It was as if the sparkle in his eyes had completely disappeared. The doubts intensified when, on a particularly frosty night, some neighbors heard unusual noises coming from the yard. Joao, who was already suspicious, decided to observe from afar. What he saw perplexed him. Lucas's father, Marcos, came out of the back door carrying what looked like a chain. He attached it to the boy's ankle and fixed it to a nearby post. Lucas didn't scream, he didn't struggle, he just curled up even more on the mattress, as if this was already part of his routine. It was at that moment that Joao realized he wasn't dealing with a simple punishment or a passing problem. Something much deeper and more disturbing was going on. He tried to talk to other neighbors about what he saw, but reactions were mixed. While some believed it was time to intervene, others hesitated, fearing that they might be misinterpreting the situation. After all, no one wanted to be responsible for creating confusion without concrete evidence. But the situation reached a critical point when Lucas began to show visible signs of extreme tiredness and malnutrition. His face, once full of life, was pale and thin. The deep circles under his eyes and his stooped posture made it obvious that he wasn't well. When Dona Helena tried again to approach him at the gate, he mumbled something that left a lump in her throat. "They're trying to protect me, but I don't want to stay outside anymore." Those words were enough to convince John and the other neighbors that it was time to act. Something was terribly wrong, and waiting any longer could put Lucas' life at risk. They decided that the only solution was to call the police and let the authorities investigate what was really going on behind that wooden fence. What they didn't imagine was that what they would find would be even darker than anyone had suspected. When the police arrived at Lucas' house, the atmosphere seemed strangely calm. The doorbell rang a few times before Anna opened the door with a smile that seemed forced. Marcos appeared right behind her and for a moment tried to project a confident posture, but his eyes gave away the tension he felt. The officers explained that they had received reports of possible mistreatment and asked to take a look at the yard. Anna's countenance changed instantly. Her eyes widened and for a second she seemed about to protest. But before she could say anything, Marcos intervened, nodding in agreement. "Of course, you can come in. We have nothing to hide," he said, as he led the policeman into the yard. Anna stood at the entrance, wringing her hands, as if every second of that visit was consuming her from the inside out. The yard was exactly as the neighbors had described it: a worn mattress on the grass, thin blankets scattered around, and a rusty chain still attached to the post. But Lucas wasn't there. The mattress was empty, and the silence in the air seemed to shout louder than any accusation that could be made. The police immediately asked where the boy was. Anna tried to answer, but the words came out slurred, while Marcos kept a calm tone, saying that Lucas had gone to a close relative's house to spend the night. However, the excuse was not convincing. One of the police officers decided to enter the house to search while another examined the yard. When the officer returned, carrying Lucas by the hand, everyone froze. The boy was hiding in the small basement of the house, a cramped, dark space that smelled of mold. Lucas wasn't crying, but his eyes told a story of fear and exhaustion. He was thin, his hair was disheveled, and there were visible scratch marks on his arms and legs. But what was most striking was the expression on his face, a mixture of relief and terror, as if he didn't know whether to feel safe or more vulnerable than ever. "It's all right, Lucas. You can tell us what's going on," said the officer in a soft tone, trying to calm him down. The boy hesitated, looking at his parents as if asking for permission. It was then that Anna began to cry uncontrollably. Marcos, on the other hand, stood firm, with his arms crossed, as if defying any accusation that might come his way. The revelation came slowly, with Lucas speaking in a low voice, as if afraid that his words might bring even more painful consequences. He explained that weeks before, he had started having recurring nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. The screams were so loud that, according to Marcos, they could attract unwanted attention. "They said it was for my safety," Lucas whispered, looking at the floor. The parents' justification was that Lucas was possessed by something evil, something that could only be kept under control if he stayed away from the house at night. They believed that the screams were a sign that a supernatural presence was attacking him. Anna, still crying, admitted that she had consulted a local healer, who suggested that the boy should sleep outside to purify his energy. Marcos stressed that everything they had been done with the intention of protecting his son. The police were torn between indignation and disbelief. How could parents believe that the solution to any problem would be to put a child alone, in the cold, exposed to all kinds of danger? The explanation made no sense, but at the same time, It was obvious that Anna genuinely believed what she was saying. According to her, the healer had said that if Lucas remained inside the house, the presence could grow stronger and even harm the whole family. While the officers recorded the statements, the mood between the parents began to change. Anna seemed to be on the verge of collapse, muttering that all she wanted was to save her son. Marcos, however, became more defensive, insisting that the police were overreacting and that they had the right to take care of their son as they saw fit. The most tense moment came when one of the police officers found a notebook full of notes in the basement. The pages were scribbled with strange symbols, accompanied by disconnected phrases that spoke of spiritual protection and emotional sacrifice. There was even a drawing of Lucas sleeping in the backyard, surrounded by circles that looked like representations of protection. Anna started screaming when she saw the notebook, begging the police not to take it. "It's the only thing that's helped us so far," she exclaimed, holding Marcos's hands as if she expected him to beg too. Lucas, however, remained silent throughout, watching everything with an expression of resignation that would break the heart of anyone who looked at him. It was clear to the police that this family needed help, but not the kind they believed they were looking for. The problem wasn't just the negligent treatment. It was the distorted mentality that had turned Lucas' life into a nightmare, even more real than the ones he slept through. The officers decided to take Lucas to a safe place while they conducted a more thorough investigation. Anna tried to stop them, clutching the boy and crying desperately, but Marcos, for the first time, seemed to lose his temper. He shouted that if they took Lucas, the consequences would be worse than anything they could imagine. The words were loaded with a threat that no one could fully interpret. With Lucas safe and his parents detained for questioning, the case took an even darker turn. What appeared to be simple neglect turned into something much more complex, involving deep-seated beliefs, fear, and decisions that placed a defenseless child at the center of emotional and psychological chaos. The true extent of what Lucas had faced would only begin to be understood in the following days, when the investigations brought to light even more disturbing secrets. While Lucas was under the care of the Child Protection Service, the investigation began to unravel the darker layers of the story. Neighbors, initially hesitant, began to share information that deepened the mystery. One of them, an elderly woman called Dona Clara, mentioned that in recent weeks she had heard not only Lucas's screams, but also muffled chants coming from the backyard in the early hours of the morning. She described sounds that, according to her, sounded like invocations, with words she couldn't understand, but which made her deeply uneasy. Other neighbors reported seeing Marcos carrying strange objects into the yard, such as black candles and containers filled with some kind of dark liquid, while Anna stood nearby, holding something that looked like an old book. Investigations revealed that the notebook found in the basement was not just a pile of scribbles. An expert called in by the police department confirmed that the symbols and texts were part of a manual of occult rituals, something that Marcos and Anna apparently followed fervently. The family had consulted the healer mentioned by Anna, but his recommendations didn't stop at letting Lucas sleep in the yard. The healer convinced them that the boy was a conductor of an evil energy which, if not purified, would bring destruction to the family. This idea, combined with the instructions in the book, led the parents to believe that they needed to perform rituals to save not only Lucas, but themselves. However, the situation was even more dire than it appeared. During a longer deposition, Anna ended up confessing that Lucas wasn't just sleeping in the yard because of the nightmares. The rituals involved direct actions with the boy, such as forcing him to sit in uncomfortable positions for hours, surrounded by lit candles, while Marcos read passages from the book. Anna cried as she told this, claiming that she never wanted to hurt her son and that she only followed the instructions because she believed it was the only way to protect him. However, the police began to realize that Marcos was the real leader of everything. He seemed to control Anna with a mixture of fear and manipulation, and she, terrified, followed his orders. As the evidence accumulated, an even more disturbing discovery was made. On Marcos's cell phone, investigators found messages exchanged with the healer. In the texts, there were mentions of a last ritual, something that Marcos seemed to be planning to carry out soon. This ritual, according to the messages, would require Lucas to spend an entire night in the yard, but this time he would be tied to the pole with the chain that the neighbors had seen. In addition, there were references to sacrifices, and although it wasn't clear what this meant, investigators feared the worst. When questioned, Marcos denied everything. He claimed that the messages were misinterpreted and that he would never harm his son. However, his calm demeanor began to crumble when the police presented more compelling evidence, videos found on his cell phone. The videos showed Marcos and Ana performing rituals in the backyard, while Lucas was in the center, visibly terrified and trying to hold back tears. In one of the videos, Marcos was holding a knife while reciting something from the book, although fortunately there was no evidence that he had used the weapon physically against Lucas. The emotional climax of the investigation came when Lucas finally felt safe enough to share his full version of events. He explained that his parents said everything was for his own good, but that he felt he was being punished for something he didn't understand. He described the terror of being alone in the yard, hearing strange noises and feeling the cold of the night, while his parents watched him from afar, muttering things he couldn't understand. Lucas talked about the scariest moment, a night when Marcos tied him to the post and told him that if he didn't stop screaming during the nightmares, something much worse would happen. Lucas' accounts, combined with the physical evidence, led the police to a frightening conclusion. The parents really believed they were protecting Lucas, but they had crossed the line between concern and fanaticism. They had allowed themselves to be consumed by a narrative that justified the abuse in the name of a supposed spiritual salvation. The moment of greatest tension came when Marcos was formally arrested. He tried to resist, shouting that the authorities were making a mistake and that they didn't understand what was at stake. As he was taken away by the police, he looked at Ana and shouted, "They're not going to protect us when the worst happens." Ana, for her part, collapsed on the floor, crying uncontrollably, as if at that moment she had realized the gravity of what they had done. Lucas, now safe, was taken to a temporary shelter, where he began to receive psychological care. The professionals who attended him described him as a resilient child, but deeply scarred by what he had experienced. He still had trouble sleeping and on several occasions would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming for his parents, a reflection of the trauma he was carrying. The case had national repercussions, with heated debates about the dangers of extreme beliefs and the impact of fanaticism on raising children. The community that had previously remained silent now seemed divided. While some blamed Marcos and Ana alone, others began to question the role of the healer and even society itself, which failed to notice the warning signs before the situation reached such an extreme point. Marcos's arrest and Lucas' reception by the protection services marked the end of a horrible chapter in that family's life, but the beginning of a long and painful journey of recovery. Lucas, although free of the immediate threat, would carry the scars of the trauma for a long time. In the months that followed, the therapists who accompanied him began to perceive a confused child, still tormented by the echoes of fear and insecurity. Lucas' psychological suffering was not only physical, but also emotional and mental. He, who had been treated as an object of belief and superstition, was now trying to understand the concept of love and care in a completely new way. Ana, the mother, was in prison along with Marcos, but her sentence was slightly more lenient. She pleaded guilty, claiming that she had been carried away by her husband's pressure and the wrong beliefs he had nurtured in her. She argued that she didn't know it was abuse, and many, despite the evidence, couldn't understand how she could have remained so blind to her son's pain. Society was divided over Ana's guilt. Some saw her as a victim of fanaticism, while others considered her complicit in allowing Lucas to suffer. The case sparked a public debate about the fine line between personal beliefs and abuse camouflaged by them. The child protection system was pressured to improve its vigilance over similar cases, alerting society to how easily children can be manipulated by authority figures or by ideas that distort reality. The healer, who had initially proved to be a figure of power in the lives of Marcos and Ana, was also held accountable and was the subject of a separate investigation that revealed other dangerous and potentially fatal practices. For Lucas, the physical scars were curable, but the mental and emotional ones would be a much greater challenge. He would never see the world in the same way again. However, over time, and with the right support, he began to rebuild his life, understanding that his story didn't define him and that he deserved better. The legacy of this tragedy has at least been a society that is more aware and prepared to recognize the signs of abuse, whether physical or spiritual. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching. And there's something else. Nurse adopts baby that no one wanted. 10 years later, she turns pale after discovering this. That's the subject of the next video I've pinned to the screen. Just click and watch. I'll see you there.